exists. So when Dawkins says, I don't need God to explain what I find in science, I say, but I believe that God is there, so I can explain what I see in science through the fact that God has done it. The two things are both matters of faith. The science that we see is the only thing that we can measure. One of the problems, of course, is that Christians have fallen into the fallacy down the years that if I can explain something naturally, then that is nature at work, and it's what I can't explain that is God at work. And so we have this God of the gaps. Science explains this. We don't know how this works, so that must be God at work. That's not what the Bible teaches. Stuart read us from Colossians chapter 1. In him, everything is held together. All that we see happening, all these scientific laws that we see are God in action. We all know how rain happens, or doesn't happen. The sun heats the sea, the water evaporates, it forms clouds, the wind blows it over the land. As it comes over the land, it rises and cools, and so the water falls. Scientific explanation. The Bible says God makes the rain fall on the land. Both are true. What the scientist is doing is describing what God is doing. It's important we remember that. But there are other ways of reaching reality that go beyond faith and science. Art, music. The bagpipes are music. And literature. Different ways that we contact reality and we learn about how the world really is. And our problem today, even as Christians, is that we have bought into the lie that science is the only valid way of describing reality. I think I've talked about the elephant and the blind men before. A group of blind men were asked to describe an elephant. So, of course, they had to feel him. The first one goes up and feels the side of the elephant and says, an elephant is like a wall, big, flat. The other fella goes up and he puts his arms around the elephant's leg. He says, nonsense, an elephant's like a tree trunk. Another guy goes and he feels the trunk. He says, no, elephant's like a fireman's hose. Another one feels the tail and says, rubbish, it's like a rope. Somebody feels the ear and says, an elephant is like a tablecloth. We know that each of them is describing a little bit of reality, but it's only when you put it all together that you see what an elephant is. Science describes a little bit of reality, describes it very well and very effectively, but we need to put everything else together, particularly the knowledge of God, before we see reality as it is. The second reason why the first chapter of Genesis is not a scientific textbook is that science changes over time. A lot of Victorian Christian writers spent a lot of time trying to show how Genesis chapter 1 fitted with the latest advances in science, Newtonian mechanics. Then along came Einstein, who says Newton doesn't actually explain how things work at all. We've now got a theory of relativity. Then along came all the nuclear scientists, Rutherford, Kelvin, all that lot. And they said, well, wait a minute, relativity doesn't explain everything. And at the moment, we're in a situation where the physicists are trying to develop the grand unifying theory of how everything works, because we just don't know. Genesis chapter 1 was written 4,000 years ago. If the people 4,000 years ago were going to understand it, and the people now were going to understand it, it had to be written not as a scientific textbook, because our understanding of science has changed. And anyone who thinks that we have now reached the point where we know everything and the scientific theories are set in stone is wrong. That's the one thing we can guarantee, that what science believes will change in the next 20, 50 years. The third reason why it is not a scientific textbook is that why creation happened is much more important to God than how. And one of our problems is that we lock into the how did it happen, and God's interested in why. So what does Genesis tell us about God, about the world, and about ourselves. The first thing it tells us is God is bigger than we can imagine. He's a God of power. Comes out very, very clearly in this. God spoke, and it was so. There is no sort of hesitation. There is no question. There is no sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. The universe is vast. There are 100 billion stars in the Milky Way. The Milky Way is one of 100 billion galaxies. That's a big number. It's bigger than the national debt, and that's saying something. How big is the universe? We don't know. Our telescopes can only tell us that at the edge of what we can see, there's something more to be seen. And God made it all with a word. He didn't have a long design process. He didn't have months and months of building. He spoke and it happened. His wisdom is greater than we can think. I've already said scientists don't understand how the world works. Not only does God understand it, he thought of it in the first place. You know, it's a relatively simple thing to take something apart to see how it works. It's actually much more difficult to sit down with a blank sheet of paper and design something that works. But God did that. Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him? And who taught him the right way? Who was it who taught him knowledge or showed him the path of understanding? No one has taught God anything. Nobody can teach God anything. And yet, at a macroscopic level, as we look at the universe, it is absolutely mind-boggling. When we come down and look at the human body, it is just as mind-boggling. David says in Psalm 139, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And I say to David, brother, you didn't know half of it. What we have learned just in the last 50 years about how the body works is just incredible. About 20-odd years ago, I thought I had got a grasp of how cell division takes place. This is very important if you're a cancer specialist. And I got it all sussed. I'd read all the latest stuff. And I went to a meeting and somebody stood up and said, well, you know, this is how we think it works. And we all said, yeah. He said, well, we've discovered this, and there's something more complicated. And there's just layers and layers and layers of complication. And yet God has designed it all. He's a wonderful God. And yet, with all that, God is a person. And Genesis chapter 1 is very, very clear that God is a person. He commands, he thinks, he decides, he discusses. In verse 26 we read, God in discussion, let us make man in our image. God is not an impersonal force. God is not the power principle behind the universe. God is a person. And he is transcendent. He is different from the world he created. People talk about Mother Nature being wonderful and Mother Nature doing this. Mother Nature doesn't do anything. It's God who does it. And God is not part of the creation. We again have this tendency, we can't help it, to think that God's just a bigger version of us. Don't we? Because God uses pictures like Father and Lover, which suggests to us, it's the only way we can understand, but it's a mistake if we think then that God's just a bigger version of us. He is completely other than us. The mystery is that he loves us. The second thing we learn is that the world is not a product of chance. There is order in the world. And despite Professor Dawkins, I personally cannot understand how you can believe that order can arise out of chaos. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that everything is descending towards chaos. If you leave things without putting any input into them, they become chaotic. That's the way life is. That's the way the world is. But somewhere along the line, the whole thing was turned around and order was imposed. Genesis chapter 1 doesn't give us that in scientific equations, but it does give us it in literary form. It starts, the earth was formless and empty. And then the first 3 days, God is giving form to the earth. Let there be light. Let the waters separate. Let the dry ground appear. Let the vegetation appear. And then, in days 4 to 6, God is filling the earth. So formlessness becomes formed, emptiness becomes filled. And he fills it first with the fishes, the birds, the animals, and then humans. What the writer is saying is there is an order, there is a structure. This is the way God works. Have you noticed that it's always evening and morning? Evening and morning was the first day. Evening and morning was the second day. Why? People will tell you it's because that's the way the Jews count days. Now that's actually backside foremost. The reason the Jew counts the day starting with the evening is because Genesis chapter 1 counts the day as starting with the evening. If you think about morning, it's sort of hopeful, full of promise, and as the day goes on, it gradually deteriorates, usually. Yeah? And you get to the evening and you think, oh. This starts with the oh, and then moves through to the promise and the new things, because that's the way God works. He starts with nothing and he moves to something. He starts with chaos and he moves to order. He starts with darkness, he moves to light. He starts with emptiness, he moves to fullness. There is order in creation. There's purpose in creation. Genesis chapter 1 is all about God preparing the earth for humans. We've got to understand that the Bible primarily is about God's relationship with mankind. It kind of ignores the other 100 billion universes, 100 billion galaxies that there are in the universe, and just focuses on our relationship with God. And so the story of creation, apart from that wonderful beginning, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, the rest of the story is about God getting the earth ready for us. And the purpose of creation was to bring men and women into relationship with God. Don't ask me why, but that's what it was for. And the other purpose of creation is to show God's glory. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. One of the reasons God creates is so that his glory can be revealed, so that we can see what kind of God he is. I say it reverently, but in a sense, God can't help creating, because that's who he is. The third thing that we learn from Genesis chapter 1 is that we can't ignore God with impunity. We are dependent on God. No matter whether we acknowledge that God is there or not, no matter whether we acknowledge that we are dependent on God or not, we are dependent on God. Every one of us. Richard Dawkins, just as much as Sam Leinster, is dependent on God for every breath he takes. He himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. For in him we live and move and have our being. The notion that we can ignore God and go our own way and do our own thing is a complete fallacy. We cannot exist without God. The psalmist says, you give them their breath. Every breath that any animal takes, God gives it. And if you don't give them their breath, they don't breathe and they die. We're again trying to get this idea that God isn't way out there. It's not that he created the world and wound it up and there it is ticking away all on its own and we can choose to ignore God if we want. God is intimately involved in every minute of every day of every person's life. and we're responsible to God.